Hey everybody, happy Tuesday. Welcome to Get Ready With Me and Talk About Stuff. I am your host, Stephanie McCown. Welcome to the show. This show is just for fun today. Today, I'm going to be putting on my makeup and getting ready for the day. It's a little late in the day, but that's okay. And talking to you about something that is near and dear to my heart, disco. This conversation came about because I was talking with a friend on Facebook. That's how a lot of these topics come up, by the way. So if there's ever anything you want me to talk about, strike up a conversation with me and get me thinking about it. And then chances are I'll be like, you know what? I should make a video about that. But anyway, we're talking about disco and our love for disco and why disco is awesome. And I thought, you know what, it would be kind of fun to delve into the history of disco. So that's what we're going to do today. I was born in 1975, so I was born about midway through the height of the disco phenomena. But I do remember a few things, even from that tender age. I remember I must have been probably 4 years old, and I was going to church with the family because I was too young to drive, didn't go by myself. And I remember, so a couple things I remember from that era, okay? I remember there was a guy who attended church, and he was a regular. He was there every Sunday, but he always wore like those silk shirts that opened like down, you know, about midway down his chest, and he had the gold chains, and he had the aviator glasses with the gradient tint on them. And I just remember thinking, well, that's different, because, you know, in church, that's not something you might be accustomed to seeing. So that was one thing that I remember from that time. Secondly, I remember when, so again, in church, we were given like stuff to do during service on Sunday mornings, because either I must have been too young for children's church or just didn't want to go or something. I don't remember. But I do remember being given a coloring book by a friend's parents, because my parents would never have bought this. It was the Muppets, but it was like Saturday Night Fever style. Like Kermit was wearing the jumpsuit and doing the finger pointing and, you know, all that stuff. And Miss Piggy had her long flowing hair and she was wearing a jumpsuit. It was just something else. And I remember it very clearly because I remember looking at it thinking, well, this is not the kind of coloring books my parents give me, you know, because my parents they were not into disco whatsoever. However, I will say, when we were a little older, I should preface this by saying we were not good children. I was very naughty. I was very naughty, I will tell you that. So I remember my mom had this record. Remember when singles used to be sold on records instead of cassette tapes, and then now you buy them on the interwebs. But this was back in the days when you could buy a single song on a record. And this would have been slightly after the disco craze, but this was like as close to embracing the disco craze as my parents got. Or maybe it was, I don't know, right in the middle of it. I don't know. Anyway, so my mom had this album, this single of Celebrate by Kool and the Gang. And I, being the delightful child I was, thought it would be hilarious to try to get my sister to break it. I don't know why I thought that. I was only, let's see, she was about 3 maybe. So I would have been 7. And I just thought, and my brother participated too. So if he ever watches this and tries to proclaim his innocence, it's a lie. Anyway, we thought it'd be funny to try to get my sister to break the record over her knee, because as I mentioned, we were not good children. And she did it. And I remember my mom was just like, she was angry, but she had also, I guess, just kind of accepted that you know, she had resigned herself to the situation, I guess is what I was saying. She had rotten kids, not for lack of parenting on her part. We were just rotten children. And I think about that now, and I think, you know, I'm a mom now myself, and there are so few things that moms get that are really just for them, that are just, you know, something that they treasure that is just for them. And keep in mind too, when this happened in our family, this was in, you know, during a recession. I mean, I remember my dad was sometimes out of work, money was scarce, and she had this one thing that she really loved, and we convinced my sister to break it. So, sorry, Mom, if you're ever going to watch this. I don't know if you watch my videos or not, but I'm sorry. Anyway, so the history of disco. Let's dive in. So there is a lot of debate about when disco was actually born. However, what we do know is the disco era was made official, I guess, on July 14th, 1970, when David Mancuso, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but he bought the Loft in New York City, and that was the first of many such clubs that he would open. And that is when disco as its own thing was officially born. Now, one thing that surprised me in my research, and I guess I knew this but didn't know this, is disco did not always sound like disco. So prior to, say, 1972, when disco, you know, dance clubs were a thing, but not necessarily disco, a lot of what would count as disco back then was stuff that was heavily influenced by like Motown, by, you know, more pop music and stuff. For instance, you know, Papa Was a Rolling Stone. That was considered, you know, that's considered an early disco song. And that would change when the song Soul Makossa would come out in 1972. This song, and if you've never heard it, I recommend you do give it a listen. You've heard some of the lyrics. Michael Jackson in his song, Wanna Be Starting Something, when he says, Mama say, Mama sa, Mama kusa. Now, those aren't his own made-up words. Those are actual real words in another language. But when I listened to Soul Makossa, I was like, oh my gosh, I know those words, because they're in that song. And it does indeed mean you're a vegetable. And I think these days we probably wouldn't recommend calling people a vegetable, but back then it was perfectly fine. You're a vegetable. You're brain dead. You're making stupid decisions. That's what that meant. Anyway, so this song would change everything. So what counted as disco prior to this was very much in the vein of Motown. The songs told a story. They had like a well-defined, you know, verse and then chorus. And the song was heavily focused on the performer. This song, Soul Makossa, I don't know. It would change everything, though. If you listen to the song, and you can find it on Amazon Prime Music, that's where I looked for it, because again, disco was before my time. You'll hear that the song is not focused on a story. It is focused on a beat. It is focused on creating a rhythm. It is focused on making people want to get up and dance. That is what it's for. And this was very different from what people had heard before. Now, there are only some people in the beginning who were, you know, disco aficionados. The reason that disco had such appeal, aside from the amazing music, is because it didn't appeal to just one demographic. Now, throughout history, music and dance has long been used as a form of protest. It's a form of being subversive in a way that's nonviolent, that gets a point across, but does not engage in violent behavior to make that point. Disco was no different. Disco was born out of the in part anyway, out of the disenchantment that younger baby boomers were feeling with the hippie movement. You know, they had been told, you know, you're not with it, you're not hip, because they didn't fall into formation, I guess, with the hippies. And so throughout the hippie era, which some would say ended with the night of the Manson family murders at Cielo Drive, which I did discuss in a previous, not the murders themselves, I discussed Sharon Tate. But a lot of people believe that the hippie era really ended that day in 1969, and what followed was sort of a slight pushback, but I would say also just a greater evolution of what began with the hippie movement. So the one demographic disco appealed to was the young baby boomers who felt like they didn't have a place in the hippie movement. It also appealed, though, more so, I would say, to marginalized groups such as Black Americans, Latino Americans, and also women, and significantly gay men. So disco started out as kind of an underground thing because it was really a place for people who felt they had nowhere else to go where they could be safe. They could come to these clubs and dance and enjoy themselves, and nobody was going to tell them they didn't belong there. It also appealed strongly to the middle class, and the reason the middle class and working classes really loved, blue-collar workers really loved disco is because it allowed them access to a world that was glamorous, it was exciting. For the price of getting into a club, they could enjoy themselves in a glamorous lifestyle for one evening that they otherwise would not have had access to. I'm going to share with you a story a friend of mine shared with me when I had posted something on Facebook about 1970s men's fashion, and I was like, bring it back, because 1970s men's fashions, like especially the disco type, let's be honest, they were pretty cool, weren't they? So I put that out there, and I got a lot of responses. And one of them was was a friend of mine who said she remembered going to the disco with her husband when they were young. And I asked her, if you'd like to share a little something, I'd be happy to share it with you in my video, or with the world in my video. So Peggy, I'm going to share your story now. So she says, funny story about my disco days. Me and my husband were so young, 20 and 21, when we moved to Pensacola, Florida. Disco was a big thing then. We were poor, but money wasn't that important to us. We had saved a very small amount of money, but we were looking forward to a night out on the town at the favorite disco club. My husband took me to a very nice dress shop and picked out a beautiful silk pink but very expensive $300 dress for me to wear that night. It was money we shouldn't have spent on such an expensive dress, but by the end of the night, we both said it was worth it. It's a night we'll never forget. Since then, we have become a little more frugal, and we'd never spend that much money on a dress. Well, unless disco came back. Thank you, Peggy. I really do like your story, and it really speaks to part of the appeal of disco. It wasn't something that was available exclusively to people who had wealth and connections. This was something that anybody, regardless of their financial status, could enjoy. And that was part of the wide appeal of disco. The life of disco, it really was its very own thing. In the beginning, when disco first took off, there were about 1,500 or so clubs in the whole country. By the time the disco era came to an end, there were over 40,000 clubs across the country. Disco also had become its own style of music. The heavy synthesizer, the futuristic sounds, the multimedia presentation that you'd find in the clubs, those were all unique to disco. Disco also helped further the sexual revolution. If you listen to the lyrics of a lot of disco songs, which again, they're not there to tell a story. It's all very repetitive. It's just driven by the beat. It's designed to get you out on the floor dancing. It's just, a lot of it is very sexual. And it's unapologetically sexual. And not only is it sexual, but it is sexual in a way that previously would not have been okay, because you have gay men singing about sexual encounters. You had people who would later come out as lesbians singing about sexual encounters. I mean, and then there was just, of course, the good old-fashioned heterosexual sex that was happening in these songs. I mean, it's like everybody was having sex. And also the style of dancing was far more sexual than anything that had been previously seen. So disco was about acceptance for anyone who felt like they didn't belong anywhere else. You could go there and you can belong. It was about freedom, freedom in expression, freedom in your creativity. It was about glamour. It was about sophistication. And I think that was something that was probably lacking in some of the previous, I guess, I just lost my train of thought. Like some of the previous styles of music and so forth, the social impact of well, let me back up. So the social impact of the previous era, the hippie era, was being manifest in disco in a very different way, in a more sophisticated way. So in the 1960s, you had, people's social consciousness was starting to become more elevated. People became more aware of issues that maybe didn't necessarily directly impact them, such as, perhaps racism, poverty, how homosexuals are perceived and so forth. There were movies being made about it, books being written, songs being sung. All through, the 1960s, we had this elevation in people's social consciousness. And then in the disco era, that took on a more sophisticated tone in that, it was put into action in situations that previously had not been seen before. People were no longer tolerating, the bigotry and the racism that had for so long just been part of American culture. And so for this brief window of time, we had, it was a large movement of people who were saying, okay, in addition to the protests and everything that happened in the 1960s, now we're going to take this and we're going to apply it to different elements of society, one of them being how we enjoy our music and with whom and who's accepted into this circle. And the thing with the disco culture was that it was very inclusive for its time. And even now, I would say, it's far more inclusive than a lot of spaces are even today in 2021. I think that disco allowed people to experience roughly a decade of really finding a place to belong, regardless of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, and feeling safe there. All of that would change later because part of the backlash, I think, from what I've experienced myself growing up in church and what I see, what we see happening politically and so forth as far back as the early 1980s, I think part of the pushback for the acceptance that was encouraged in the 1970s is, an equally conservative, equally bigoted response, an equally bigoted pushback. But for the decade that disco reigned supreme, inclusivity and acceptance was just how people functioned. It was just, at least in that culture, it was just part of the culture. You did not get to go in there and say certain people don't belong. So disco had a glamorous accepting, gorgeous decade of, you know, exploring new sounds, exploring new ways of self-expression, exploring new fashion. Disco fashion is its own thing. It really is a sight to behold, to look at some of the, I love looking at vintage ads out of like the Sears catalog or the JCPenney catalog. I guess Sears back in that time was less, you know, even still today is less clothing oriented and so forth. But JCPenney, vintage JCPenney ads from the 1970s are something else. So are sewing patterns and makeup ads and anything from that era. It's just, to me, I look at those things and I think, that is awesome that people felt that free to explore these forms of self-expression through their makeup and their clothing. Speaking of makeup, I forgot to get something, so I'm going to pause. I will be right back. All right, I'm back. Thank you. So disco enjoyed a decade of just being splendiferous. People loved it. And you know, it started off as something that was underground, and it eventually became something embraced by the middle class. In 1977, the movie Saturday Night Fever was released, and that was when disco as a mainstream thing really took off. People had already been kind of, you know, the middle class had already been, and I want to rephrase that. The suburban middle class, which was predominantly white and remains predominantly white, unfortunately, we're catching on to the true awesomeness of disco, and we're starting to go to these discos all over the country. But it was after Saturday Night Fever came out that it really took off, and disco became just this ever-present force. It was always on the radio. It was, you know, records were flying off the shelves. It really took on a life of its own after Saturday Night Fever came out. Now, unfortunately, that would be the beginning of the end for disco. Before we get into the post-mortem of disco, I want to read this to you. So, Maurice Gibbs said in 1987, after Saturday Night Fever, we wanted to do a poster with the three of us in Rambo bodies with machine guns, and in the background, there'd be a body in a white suit, bullet-ridden, and the mirror ball shot to pieces. What happened with disco is what happens with so many things that become popular. They become popular, they take on a life of their own, and unfortunately, the market gets saturated with this popular thing. Could be a book, could be a movie, could be anything, and suddenly people get sick of it. They don't want to see it again, and they are more than happy to see it end. This is what would happen with disco in 1979. So, July 12th, 1979, at Comiskey Park in Chicago, there was a doubleheader. White Sox and the Detroit Tigers had a doubleheader. In an effort to boost attendance for this, two DJs by the name of Steve Dahl and Gary Meyer, they were DJs at a very popular station called The Loop, and because of the popularity of disco, these rock DJs were essentially replaced because the radio station had decided, as many radio stations did at the time, that they were going to go with a full disco, what did they call it? A disco format for their radio station. They were done with playing rock music. They were going with disco, and they were getting new DJs who were more in touch with the, you know, the disco phenomenon. And these two guys found themselves out of jobs. because disco had ruined their lives. So they thought it would kind of be funny to have a disco demolition. That's not what they called it at the beginning, but it would eventually become known as that. So what the idea was they were going to sell tickets. They were going to advertise that this disco demolition was going to be happening at this game. And they sold tickets, I believe they were like 90 cents a piece or something like that. Now, on an average game, the crowd was about 15,000 people. They thought with the tickets, you know, in the fun of the disco demolition, maybe they would get 20,000 people. What ended up happening was they had a sellout crowd of 40,000 people, and they had an overflow crowd of, it's estimated, an additional 40,000 people outside of the stadium. This was going to be a massive, massive event that they were in no way prepared to handle. So what would happen is people would bring their disco records in with the intention that at the right time, the disco records were going to be put into a pile, and some would be put into a dumpster and then the dumpster would be lit, and, you know, here you have a dumpster fire of disco. That, unfortunately, is not what happened at all. What ended up happening was they didn't collect the records as people came in, which you think would have made a lot of sense. You'd be right about that. They did not do that, though. What they did was they allowed people to take their seats, records in hand, and those records would then become projectiles that were thrown throughout the event. So you can still find pictures today of, you know, records that were like cracked in half and then thrown, and they like landed. Some people got hit with them. Some of them landed in such a way that they just stuck in the ground, so they're sticking up out on the field. And so the idea was that this disco demolition was going to happen during warm-ups between games. And because they didn't collect the records, and the records began, you know, the people were using them as projectiles, it helped create a frenzy. Okay, so you've got all these people who are armed and dangerous with disco records they want to destroy. You have a very poorly planned event with more people than they even know how to handle. And you have people coming out onto the field. The fans literally stormed the field. It got crazy. Once people started storming the field, there was no gaining any control over the situation. People were climbing up the foul poles. People were, you know, continuing to throw records and smash the records. There was a fire that was lit on the pitcher's mound. People were just out of control, and reports are that the smell of pot hung heavy in the air. So there is a lot happening, and it got so out of control. So over the loudspeaker, they were trying to calm down the fans, telling them to return to their seats. They started playing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" in an effort to calm people down and remind them we are here for a ball game. Now remember, get back to your seats. To no avail. This insanity that had been unleashed, there was no reeling it in, and it was just absolutely out of control. By the time it was over, there would be, hold on and I will get you some statistics, there would be at least 9 injuries, and that's the low end of the spectrum, I'm guessing, 39 arrests, and things got so dangerous. It was determined they could not safely start the second game, so the White Sox had to forfeit to the Detroit Tigers, and that was that. That was the disco demolition, and it is credited or blamed, depending on who you talk to and what their feelings are, for the end of disco. What happened after? Well, let's talk about that. So, a lot of the you know, people say that that was the end of disco, but I do have vague memories of the early 80s, which was what immediately followed the end of the disco era. People were like, disco is dead, yeah! And what followed was a whole lot of homophobia. So a lot of people speculate that at least part of the reason for the pushback against disco had to do with the outbreak of what would come to be known as the AIDS virus. Back then, they used a very homophobic term for it that I don't even want to repeat, because they were convinced that this virus was exclusive to the gay community, and so they gave it a name that reflected as such. And it would ultimately find out, oh yeah, you know what, straight people can get it too. Anyway, back then though, it was believed that it was something that was just part of the gay community, and it was because they lived the quote gay lifestyle, which people still talk about. And, you know, sidebar, it's not a lifestyle, it's not a choice, it is just who people are. Some people are gay, deal with it. Anyway, so part of the reason why people said disco needed to die was what they euphemistically referred to as moral decay. Now, keep in mind, disco's main audience were marginalized people that were, you know, Black Americans, Latino Americans, gay Americans. So calling it a tool of moral decay is very poorly masked dog whistling, I guess. It's a very poorly masked dog whistle for saying we don't like, I mean, and I'm not the only one who holds this opinion, but what I'm saying right now is my own opinion. For saying, it's just a way of saying that they don't like the music because it is something that appeals primarily to people that they don't like, that they have very bigoted feelings toward, very racist feelings toward. Now, the aftermath of the the Disco Demolition was a lot of commentary, even back then, from people who said, you know, this whole event just reeked of racism, of homophobia, of sexism. Because keep in mind, too, disco also had a large appeal to women who really did, up to that point, did not have a place where they could go just on their own and find acceptance. They had to have a partner with them, and that partner had better be a man. And they, you know, in disco, in these clubs, women found acceptance they didn't have otherwise. So, you know, so you have a lot of things happening all at once, but the growing awareness of AIDS and the growing severity of the crisis, from what I recall of the early 80s and what I recall of the rhetoric surrounding, you know, disco music was never specifically discussed, but it was kind of understood that disco belonged to a crowd of people who were morally deviant, I guess is the nicest way to say it. You know, like I said, I grew up in church, and if there's one thing white evangelicals are very good at, it's projection. So, you know, it's easy to say that the things that they didn't care for reasons that had nothing to do with the thing itself, were because of moral decay. And disco was no exception. And I really think that the outbreak, you know, the AIDS crisis that was only in its very beginning stages back then, really provided people with a convenient excuse to say disco, this thing loved by gay people and Black people and women, needs to die. And it did. It did. Disco would never, ever return to its former glory. Now, I do think a lot of people still love disco. I think a lot of people still listen to disco. I think disco will never die, but it will never again be what it once was, and that is due almost entirely to the demolition. I keep calling it the demolition derby. The disco demolition and everything that took place that awful day. Because it really, as often happens with things like this, we even see it now. It gave people a platform, however large or small, for airing their grievances against these marginalized groups that had embraced disco, and gave them a, it gave them a pass on expressing truly violent thoughts about these people. Growing up as I did, I will never, ever, ever believe it was all about the music, that people just didn't like the music. I don't buy that. I think that it is much deeper than that, and I think everything that happened after, with the way people who had AIDS were treated, with the way, even today, things that are embraced by marginalized communities are still seen as problematic by white people. I think it would be disingenuous to say that the only reason people wanted disco to die was because they just didn't like the music. That's just my personal take. I am not an expert on disco or any of this. I'm just talking. But growing up as I did, and knowing what I know, that's what I suspect. All right, I'm going to finish this up and then be back with some final thoughts about why these stories matter. I will be right back. Okay, I'm back. Do you like? I'm wearing a lot of glitter on my face today, in an effort to look, I guess, like a disco mural ball. Anyway, so why are these stories important to tell? Number one, because there's still this idea, and this is also part of what inspired today's episode. There is still this idea that people recognizing their sexuality as something other than heterosexual is a new thing. There was an article in, I think it was USA Today, just a couple weeks ago that said, more people are identifying as LGBTQ, and, made it sound like, just the population was just being taken over by gay people and transgender people and lesbians, and if only, but for real, they acted like this was a new thing. Here's the thing, it's not that more people are becoming LGBTQ, it's that more people are feeling safe to come out. LGBTQ people have been around forever. We're not new, we're not part of a fad or a trend. We are people who knew from a young age that we did not fit the mold of cisgender, heterosexual, so forth, and finally felt safe enough to say so. So the idea that this community is new, the idea that coming out is happening only because it's a trend, that is an idea that needs to go. And one of the reasons I wanted to share about the history of disco is because it is very much about the gay community as much as it is about music or anything else, because it was the gay community that really helped disco become a thing. Okay, so to say that the gay community is new and that children are realizing their sexuality at a younger age because they're being recruited by Hollywood or whatever, it's just simply not true. People are just feeling more safe to come out now. That's as simple as it is. The world has evolved enough that people are feeling safe enough to say, this is who I am, this is who I've always been, I hope you can accept it. Regarding kids coming out, a lot of kids who come out to their families, especially if their families have a conservative religious background, they end up on the streets. So it's not as if coming out reaps any great rewards for them. People still come out at tremendous risk to their health and safety, even in 2021. So imagine what the world would look like if it was actually safe for everyone who identified as LGBTQ to come out and say so. We wouldn't still be treating LGBTQ people as if they're a new thing, as if they're part of a fad, or just something those crazy kids are doing. And so I think it's important to share these stories. And I also wanted to make note of the fact, one reason we have a lack of elders, if you will, in the LGBTQ community is because of how people responded to the AIDS crisis early on. And it is my opinion that the backlash to disco was at least part of that. It was easier to pretend this community did not exist, or to pretend that their problems are only their problems and affect no one else, than it was to say these are human beings who are in a state of crisis and they need our help, regardless of how I may feel about their sexuality. That isn't what happened, though. What happened was people were literally left to die. And I do think that, like I've said a few times now, the pushback against disco was fueled, at least in part, by people having a homophobic mindset. It's also important to share these things because, hey, if it had not been for the disco craze, a lot of the things that we see now that are just so standard might not have happened the same way. You know, the visuals that happen at concerts and in clubs, the way sound is projected and so forth, you know, the whole atmosphere of a club is due entirely to what happened during the disco era. That is when lighting it became an art. That is when maximizing a space for the best sound became like a science in itself. That is when multimedia presentations, or yeah, I guess that's what multimedia experiences became the norm. It's because of disco. So if you enjoy going to the club, if you enjoy that whole experience, you need to thank disco. Anyway, so that was my little journey down, I can't say memory lane because I wasn't there for most of it, but that was our little journey into the history of disco. Forever and always one of my favorite kinds of music. Disco does not suck. I don't care what anybody says. Disco does not suck. And I could listen to it all day long. It makes me want to get up and dance. Not that I dance well, but you don't have to dance well. You just have to dance, right? Anyway, so I hope you have a great day. I hope this was a fun and entertaining video for you. If you like it, please subscribe. A lot of my people that watch these videos are not subscribers, according to the statistics. So if you do like my videos, please subscribe, please share. That really helps me a lot. Please like the video. And if you would like to contribute to future content, if you'd like to make future content even more exciting, there are ways that you can support my creative efforts. I will leave that in the description. Thanks again for being here. I hope you've had fun. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Be good to yourself. Be good to each other. Don't shit on yourselves or anyone else. Be safe out there. We are still in the middle of a pandemic. I know it's been a year and everybody's tired, but it's not over. It's not over. So please be careful. And I will talk to you again very soon. Bye.